really the central piece today is to see if this room and other people and sort of the broader world can kind of imagine a different sense for ourselves, knowing where we sit environmentally, of course linked to that socially, economically, and so on. This may seem like a ridiculous question, but in order for life to exist, or I guess our lives as humans, how important is air? Scale of 1 to 10, pretty important. How about water? Same. So why is it that over 50% of our waterways are polluted to the point we can't swim, fish, or drink out of them? Why is that? Headline recently in Oregon said that Oregon has, by linear miles, I guess, the most impaired and polluted waterways in the United States.
Really?
Yet we've had environmental laws since the 70s, yet here we are. So I think, hold that, because I think that's a big piece of why, from a legal perspective at least, rights with nature has emerged. Not that the system is broken. The system works a certain way because it's designed that way. But what are we doing to actually be in response to that, or participating in that, or ultimately, let's say, rejecting that and looking for a different path, with the understanding that we're not going to actually be in harmony with the ecosystem if we keep following the old ways, because the old ways are designed in a certain manner. So we're going to try to make this as participatory as possible, but just to kind of get us rolling, keep that in your head. That's largely how, at least from a legal perspective, rights of nature has emerged. People seeing a problem and looking for a different path. And to your guys' point earlier, a lot of it is really circular, right? It's about coming back to traditional ways, relationship, values, and ultimately laws themselves are an articulation of a value, right? If you have a system that values extraction and destruction and control, you're going to legalize it. You're going to normalize it. That's become the Western colonialistic way of which we all live under. The question is, do we want that or do we want something different? And I think that's largely at the core of what today is about, is to really not just explore that, but ideally when we leave here today, we didn't just have a nice engaging time with one another, but it actually substantively will mean something. I've been to a lot of these things. They're great, there's good energy, but what's the outcome? 30 plus years of this environmental law conference, what are we seeing? It's not to dismiss good work, passion, intent, but the question is, are we actually working under the existing system, or a system that's really going to get us the results that we want? Or can we actually imagine and build and develop and resist in such a way that we actually get what we deserve? And when I say we, I'm talking about the non-human community as well. So that's a big piece of it. We keep separating humans from place. And I think that's a huge piece about why we are where we are. So again, we have 3 amazing people to kind of help with that discussion. Sounds like we got a lot of knowledgeable people in the room today, that I think we're going to have a good time. To my left here, we have Craig Kaufman, U of O professor of political science. And I would say one of the leading experts around rights of nature as it's emerging globally speaking. Sitting next to Craig is Michelle Holman, who has been a long time rights of nature advocate here in Oregon, and is part of the effort to try to give the watersheds of Lane County that very status from a legal perspective as actually being rights-bearing. And next to Michelle, Kunu Bercham, who is how would you describe yourself, multimedia artist, Indian activist, and also involved in the initiative to seek rights for the watersheds here in Lane County.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kunu Bercham. I am Northern Cheyenne native on my father's side. On my mother's side, I am Ho-Chunk Nation and German. I was born here in Eugene, raised here until I was, I think, 8 years old, and then my mom moved us to New Mexico. So that's where I became a man, and then I came back here. I missed the water. I missed the beautiful Northwest, and with that experience in New Mexico, I really really understood the importance of water and the communities down there. For since time immemorial have been knowing the importance of water and how to keep water clean and safe. And it's pretty interesting. There's a lot of here, I feel like here in the Northwest we take water for granted in a way that they don't in the Southwest. So it's really cool to be here and be a part of this group of concerned humans and trying to work for a better future. And so with that, I want to share a land acknowledgement that was written by a Kalapuya elder. Her name is Esther Stutzman, and she is from this community, and she is enrolled member of the Siletz tribe, I believe. But she wrote a land acknowledgement that we've been sharing for the last few years. And this is not my phone, so I need to open it up, and then I can read it to you. Okay. So this is the land of the Kalapuya Nation, stretching from the Umpqua River to the south and northward to the falls at Oregon City. 3 dialects of the language were spoken throughout the Willamette Valley, with 12 or so distinct groups within this area. Although Kalapuya people were primarily removed to reservations at Siletz and Grand Ronde, they remain aware of their rich heritage and traditions on this land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, which we call home, the Kalapuya people, and we pay our respect to the elders, both past and present. Catastrophic epidemics of infectious diseases such as malaria and smallpox occurred after the Kalapuya contracted diseases from the white explorers, traders, and missionaries who entered the region. These diseases were endemic among the Europeans and Americans, but the Native Americans didn't have the immunity to them and died at high rates as a result. Prior to contact with white explorers, traders, and missionaries, the Kalapuya population numbered as many as 15,000 people, or more, I believe. By 1849, the remaining Kalapuyan population was estimated at just 60, with those survivors living in the most dire of conditions. Contemporary estimates suggest that the total of the various Kalapuya peoples is closer to 600. The Kalapuya people are still here and alive and live with us in this valley. And so I'd like you to say this with me, repeat after me. So, this is Kalapuya land. This is Kalapuya land. This is Kalapuya land. Thank you.
I guess I just want to do a couple of things. One is just to give a sense of the scale of the rights of nature movement, including in particular movements of people around the world to protect watersheds, because it is truly a global movement. While it may sound kind of strange and rare and unique and new, the idea has been around, many would say, for millennia. But what is new is that we're seeing movements around the world, literally hundreds of them, simultaneously demanding that these concepts be codified in formal law, in Western, what we might think of as Western law, which is really the legal system that most countries have. And so I run a program called the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor, which tries to track the development of all kinds of ecological laws. So I guess one thing I'll just throw out is that rights of nature, a rights-based approach, is really only one way of legally and culturally structuring some basic principles of prioritizing ecosystem functioning and recognizing that humans are part of the systems in which they live and so forth. And so I do want to just acknowledge that there are a number of cultures and societies that don't necessarily frame it through a rights-based lens and choose to emphasize more a responsibilities lens, and so would advocate for things like ecocide or protecting sacred natural sites and so forth. But nevertheless, they see it as all sort of the same movement of trying to change our legal and governance systems to ones that share a number of sort of principles that around here we typically associate with rights of nature. And so just to give you some numbers, I've been able to identify at least 340 attempts to implement legal provisions. So I'm talking constitution, statutory law, maybe local ordinances, case law, that recognize rights of nature around the world. And more than 2/3 of those, 219, have been approved. So it's not only that you see movements around the world advocating this stuff, it's actually being adopted by courts, by municipal councils, by state legislatures. And in one case, Ecuador, the Constitution, you may know that there was an attempt. Chile had it in their draft Constitution, but it got voted down. And in the United States alone, because many people believe our national legislative system is broken, there's a tendency not to try to do this through one national law, but rather to go down to the local level and take it to the people, essentially to bypass legislators or others that may try to block it. And so since we have a pathway of the ballot initiative, you tend to see lots of ballot initiatives and other sort of local approaches. And so for that reason, there's 134 of these rights of nature initiatives just in the United States alone. And so far, 70 of them have been approved. I'll just note that many of you probably have heard the more famous cases like Ecuador, the Wanganui River in New Zealand, or maybe Colombia's Atrato River, or may have heard that India and Bangladesh constitutional courts recognize rights for all the rivers in those countries. But there are a lot more. Those are just the ones that tend to get all the headlines. But in Canada, there's examples of the Magpie River is recognized as having rights. In Mexico, Australia, the UK, just this week, a local council passed an ordinance recognizing the Ouse River as a subject of rights, so forth and so on. And I guess I'll just notice that you mentioned Colorado. Colorado is a hotbed for these local, which you may know, right? And we're seeing it all around the United States. It's not sort of geographically isolated. There are examples in Colorado, Florida, New Hampshire, here in Oregon, all over the place, as well as many tribal nations as well. I think I've identified at least 10 tribal nations. So this is a global movement that is growing rapidly. The number, if you track it sort of historically, the number of these things doubled between 2007 and 2011. It went from sort of like a handful to about 50. And then from 2011 to 2016, it doubled from 50 to over 100. And then from 2011 to 2016, it doubled to 100, from 100 to over 200. And then just since 2016, it's more than doubled to now almost 400. So it's growing exponentially because of people like you recognize the problem and are looking to make change. So I guess another thing I wanted to do is give a sense of like what are some of the fundamental ways that, you know, if you recognize rights of nature for watersheds, how would this differ from existing environmental law? There's a bunch of ways, but I want to just sort of try to simplify it to highlight two really important points. One is that I think the focus on watersheds is important because watersheds are systems, and we're supposed to have a colleague of ours talk about the importance of sort of systems. But I guess the key point there is our existing law treats entities within nature as if they're individual stocks of resources, right? But science and a lot of traditional ecological knowledge will tell us that that's really a false understanding of the world, that actually entities in nature are interconnected because nature is a set of nested systems, and what that means is all the pieces, parts are interconnected in interdependent reciprocal relationships. And that includes humans, right? So that's why we say humans are not separate and apart from nature. We're part of the natural system. And one of the implications of that then is that, you know, we obviously need to use nature to survive. We need water, we need air, we need to grow food, to use soil, and we need other things. But rather than it being sort of a one-way extractivist process, so someone earlier, said, the way it's done now, the law treats it as just sort of a one-sided extraction. The idea is that we recognize that we humans are part of a larger system, and we're tied to these other pieces of the system through reciprocal relationships. And therefore, when we use nature to survive and to provide for our well-being, we need to understand that as part of like a reciprocal exchange. And so legally, what does that mean? So this is where we get to people, it can be really hard to think about how can we think of a whole system that's made up of millions of different parts as just a single legal entity. And is that even workable, or what would that mean? And then what would that mean for economic interests, right? Someone said, I'm grappling with trying to protect this watershed, but we have to recognize that people have interests in being able to use and access resources within a watershed. And so how does that affect property rights and all that kind of thing? And so these are complicated questions that we can go into more detail during Q&A, but I just want to use an anecdote or an analogy that I found with my students that helps them sort of understand how this would work and why it makes sense. So legally, we think of human beings as, we're individuals. But biologically, any biologist will tell you that the human body is itself an ecosystem that hosts millions of different organisms. And moreover, biologically, our bodies are actually made up of nested systems that have to all work together. Actually, 11 different systems: skeletal systems, our muscular systems, so forth, our skin system, our bone system, skeletal system, so forth and so on. And so in that sense, we're very much like watersheds, in that biologically we are made up of sort of nested systems, and we are sort of hosting millions of organisms, but it makes sense, it's useful for us, and sort of like to our daily life, to have the law treat us or pretend that we're actually legally individuals. And the same is true for watersheds. It can be true for watersheds, basically. But what would it mean then legally if we treat a watershed as a single legal individual, like a subject with rights, not a person, but a legal entity that is itself, like we can legally treat it as if it's an individual, that would, let's say, own itself, and therefore it owns its water, but we need to use some of that water for consumption and irrigation and so forth. So there's some sort of exchange, but instead of being a one-way extraction, it's now conceptualized. The law conceptualizes this as sort of an exchange between two legally equal subjects, right? And so this is where a lot of people are like, whoa, I don't know, how would that work? So to try to explain that, I use the analogy, I would argue it is conceptually no different than when we sell blood to a blood bank. So think about this. When we as an individual want to go, like if we go sell blood to the blood bank, the blood itself is not, the liquid blood is not the legal entity. It is like we as our system, as the legal entity, sell a part of that. But there are restrictions, right? A blood bank there are limits on how much blood a blood bank can withdraw, right? And the limit is basically set by how much can we take without threatening the health of the person, by which they mean we don't take so much that the individual's biologic systems start to shut down and they may be in danger of dying. Because again, systems, all the parts are interconnected. You could create a chain cascade event. And so this is one main difference between sort of the rights of nature framework and existing law, right? So it doesn't say that humans can't access and use resources within a watershed, but it says there are hard limits to how much we can extract, and those limits are determined by the threshold for systems to be able to regenerate their natural cycles. So again, you can obviously structure these things in different ways, but typically the rights of ecosystems like a watershed are the rights that they exist, by which they mean the ability to regenerate naturally their cycles, to be able to evolve naturally, and to be restored when damaged. And so this gets at the second thing. Think about when you go to a blood bank, they don't just pump you dry and then kick you out. They actually make you sit there for a little while, for about 20 minutes or so, and then they feed you orange juice or something else that's rich in folic acid, because they know they have incurred a harm to you by taking your blood. Not a significant harm, not a harm that can't be sort of restored, but they recognize that they have an obligation to try to replenish your system in a way where they can sort of give the best boost to sort of regenerate your natural cycles. So they make you sit there for 20 minutes and drink orange juice. Because they recognize that as part of this exchange, they have an obligation of restoration, or at least to facilitate that restoration. And the same is implied in a rights of nature framework. So if we take some water for consumption and irrigation, say, from a watershed that is recognized as a legal entity, the watershed doesn't take cash payment, right? What the watershed wants is the ability to have any impact. There's going to be impact, and that's not necessarily problematic so long as we have, as people, the obligation to limit our impact to the point where we don't threaten the natural cycles of the system. And we have an obligation to try to not mitigate the harm, but to help facilitate the restoration of the system's ability to regenerate its natural cycles and restore its health. And so one can imagine just inserting that into, it doesn't mean that necessarily property rights go away, but it would mean that they would be, some of them would be changed, right? Like it's hard for me to imagine how you probably can't have, property rights are a bundle of rights, right? So some of them would remain, but some of them would probably have to go away. You probably couldn't have the right to destroy your property to such an extreme extent that you can, right? So we can talk maybe more about how the framework can impact property rights, but I'm probably out of time.
No, and I think it's a good setup. I mentioned earlier, law comes from a certain view of the world, a certain orientation. I think rights of nature is trying to push a different relationship to the natural world than we currently have, and so that relationship piece is a big one. And also, as what's emerging from rights of nature work is it's looking at it sort of from the front end. So a lot of environmental law is all sort of what we would call end of the pipe, right? Something gets permitted, something happens, there's damage, and then suddenly we're trying to hold those to account who created the damage. Instead of realizing that perhaps that activity should have never occurred in the first place. So you're starting to see that emerge in some of these legal cases that are using preventative measures or precautionary principle, however you want to frame it, because the understanding is, well, we can't do some things because if we do, it's going to damage that ecosystem. Therefore, it should be not allowed to happen at all. And that's pretty much backwards about how environmental law works in the United States today. And so this is kind of that transformational piece around having this different orientation and relationship.
Wow. Tough act to follow. And just so much information that I'm processing right now. So my name is Kunu Bercham. I come here representing, I'd say, the creative class, the artivist class. I'm a filmmaker and a musician and professional creative of sorts, and I'm here as a concerned citizen, also with my personal cultural background and history of being, an Indigenous person raised in Oregon, and I'm here to try and humanize this and share some cultural values, and then also just to learn and be here to soak up the energy here and to be activated myself and to continue this work and these efforts for the next generation and for the generations after. So I'll just tell you a little story about myself and my background and how I ended up here. So I was born here in Eugene, Oregon. I shared that I'm from the Northern Cheyenne tribe and the Ho-Chunk Nation as well, and actually spent a lot of my time growing up just across the way over there at the U of O Longhouse, and I was raised with that community there, that indigenous community there, and so a lot of the people that raised me were folks who were activists themselves in the American Indian movement, and a lot of movements in the or a lot of political actions in the 70s and 60s, and and until now. But a lot of those efforts were to for human rights, for rights just to exist and to be to just be respected by the American society as a whole, right? As the civil rights movements. And so I grew up with that energy being around me from my excuse me. From my grandparents, I recently lost my grandmother, so excuse me. So I see myself as a just as a continuation of the work that that they did. Thank you. And it's with their energy that I want to insert myself into acknowledging the rights of of our land and our natural systems. And one thing that I think it was just like inherent traditional ecological knowledge of of Native nations is that rights have nature, and there was no need to that was just duh. Right? So we didn't really feel like we needed to write laws for that. And so now it's really great that there are indigenous nations around the country that are doing this. And my people, the Ho-Chunk Nation, have worked with environmental lawyers over the past, I think, few decades or so, and in the last few years, put rights of nature within their, with their constitution of their tribe as a sovereign nation. And so with that, I see that there's an opportunity for the tribes to be kind of these folks that are putting these laws on the books and kind of leading the way. And then in general, our communities around the reservations and these sovereign nations will be like looking over the fence and being like, oh wow, like I like what they're doing over there, and I think we should be doing that here, in our communities. And so that's where I see myself kind of interacting with what we're all doing here today. But I also want to share that several years ago, some family members and we went out to support the efforts at Standing Rock and with the nation there protecting their rights to clean water. And when I was out there, I had a rude awakening of how our government treats the indigenous people here and doesn't respect the concept of a sovereign nation and these nation-to-nation laws that exist and that need to be honored. So kind of being there and putting putting our bodies on the line and our freedoms to help that community to have their rights to clean water be acknowledged. It was really a rude awakening that the concept of these Indian wars have never ended. Our resources are still being extracted and taken away, and our just our sovereign rights to exist are not not being honored. So at that time, I realized that I'm an activated, concerned citizen, and I want to learn what I can do to help in these processes. So I'm just here to learn, and if we can have a conversation here and help each other out, that's why I'm here.
I'm a longtime Oregonian. I grew up in Southern Oregon, and I went to the U of O right out of high school. Thought I was going to go to law school. No disrespect to the attorneys, potential attorneys in this room, but I made a different decision, and I moved out to the Coast Range and homesteaded a piece of land. Definitely the right move for me. It's a type of paradise unequaled anywhere. I live on the confluence of two creeks. My partner and I, we built a house. I mean, there was nothing there. Had to punch in a road, the whole thing. So raised our kids there. Paradise, right? Except that really there is no place to hide. And the logging that goes on in the Coast Range is criminal, in my opinion. And the attending spraying of chemicals from helicopters, beyond criminal. So this is the later 70s. I have been battling the sprays since that time, me and my community. And I have a really stalwart community. We take care of each other. We raised each other's kids. We partied together. And we're fighting to stop the insanity. We employed all the traditional activist modes, writing letters, begging our elected officials, protesting at corporate headquarters, inviting corporate heads to come to us, having meaningless conversations with powerful people. At a certain point, it dawned on me, or it was brought to me, that there has to be a better way, a different way. The system definitely puts you in this kind of a merry-go-round of yes, we want your input, yes, we're listening to you, but actually what they always said to us is everything that's going on in your community is legal. All that corporate harm, all the incredible activity that you never asked for, these people don't even live in my community that do this kind of activity. So it's all legal. So what does a person of conscience do? She tells herself that I'm the answer. Unjust law needs to be challenged with just law. So we look at law, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. We band together and we wrote a really great law that we never got on the ballot due to all kinds of crazy obstacles that the industry put in our path, because they know how to use the system. The initiative system is the way the people legislate. That's our voice. We have to use it. Well, we're using it, and they're like, oh, they're using it. Well, we got to stop them over here. We'll stop them over here. Every hurdle they threw at us, we mounted and we persevered. We even got all the way to the Supreme Court because we were denied ballot access. And guess what the courts did? They sided with the timber interests because they just uphold law, regardless of if it's just or unjust. So we are back. We are not going away just because the Supreme Court told us to go behave ourselves. We are behaving ourselves by being by challenging, by being disruptors. We've written another law, and that's what you see on in front of you. This is the Protect Lane County Watersheds initiative. it's a kind of an end run. So we can't ban sprays because we can't get on the ballot, because we took one tact. We're being savvy activists, and we're coming at it from another place, and that is to protect the entire watershed. It's a protection, not a ban. So as we try to protect our watersheds, you can't spray chemicals from the air if you're protecting your watersheds. So I think we're really onto something. But I want to read just parts of our preamble, because this is a really elegant document that we created to protect Lane County watersheds. It says, "We, the residents of Lane County, understand that all water within the state from all sources of water supply belongs to the public, as stated in ORS 537-110, even where it flows over private land. And we believe access to clean water is a natural right of humans and all other species. In securing the health of the watersheds of Lane County, we acknowledge that watersheds are living systems and possess the inherent right to exist, flourish, regenerate, and naturally evolve for their own sake, interdependent with and independent of human needs. Lane County watersheds are essential and vital ecosystems for a healthy environment. Our watersheds include the water and land area that drains rain and snow into rivers, creeks, lakes, wetlands, aquifers, and the Pacific Ocean, within which all living things are inextricably linked. We acknowledge that the first peoples connected to these watersheds established and practiced a relationship of care, respect, and a deep sense of responsibility to ensure the health and vitality of the watersheds. A healthy watershed conserves water, promotes stream flow, supports sustainable creeks, rivers, and lakes. Due to the ever-increasing contamination and demands on our watersheds, we, the citizens of Lane County, declare our responsibility as defenders of these ecosystems to ensure their highest legal protection from degradation, loss of ecological balance, and all threats to their health and well-being. Government has failed in its responsibility to the public by enacting laws that tolerate or permit the incremental degradation of watersheds and water quality. We assert that in order to protect our water and watersheds, we must shift governance away from policies that allow voluntary compliance or directly permit pollution by entities who view nature only as lifeless property and thereby merely regulate the degree of allowable harm to be inflicted on watersheds. Pursuant to the right of self-government, as stated in the U.S. Declaration of Independence and protected by the Oregon State Constitution, if government repeatedly violates our rights, then we, the citizens of Lane County, have the right and responsibility to alter or replace that system with one that secures and protects our rights. It has become necessary that we reclaim, reaffirm, and assert our inalienable rights and extend protections that provide legal standing and rights of recognition to all watersheds in Lane County in order to ensure they are no longer subordinated as property subject to harmful actions by unaccountable political and corporate entities. Therefore, we, the citizens of Lane County, enact the Lane County Watersheds Bill of Rights, which establishes irrevocable rights for all our watersheds to exist, flourish, regenerate, and naturally evolve free from contamination and degradation, and which thereby protects their integrity and natural diversity, both now and for future generations. So we do this work because we love each other, we love the planet Earth. This work is heart work, it's purposeful heart work, and we invite you to join us. We are right now in the challenge of our ballot titles, so we thought we would have our initiative here and you would all sign it, and you'd all sign up to have your friends sign it, and those friends would have their friends sign it. But we are in a little bit of a waiting game with the county right now. Fear not, we will persevere. We will get through this little legal challenge. We expected it, actually. It's part of the work that we do. We know we will be challenged, by those who don't appreciate us targeting their bottom line. But we will be doing that soon. So please sign the sign-up sheet. We'll contact you. You'll get a signature sheet. You can gather signatures and help us get this one onto the ballot and pass it. We have 2 years to do it. With a small group of people, it will take us 2 years. But if we had an army of warriors, we could do it in 6 months, easy. The timber interest is usually, that's who's coming to get us. And they have unlimited bank funds. So yeah, we have to do fundraising. I mean, we're grassroots. We're all volunteers. There is nobody on the payroll. We do this because, you know, it needs to be done. So yeah, if you have some ideas, we're always looking for ideas. Small donations are the bread and butter of community rights work, but we would love to see some big players join our game.
Is there a database of successful propositions, laws, whatever, that have been passed by this big number that you mentioned before?
Yes.
There is?
It's called the Eco-Jurisprudence Monitor, and you can access it at ecojurisprudence.org. E-C-O-G or J-U-R-I, however you spell jurisprudence. Ecojurisprudence.org. And the reason why we came up with that really hard pronounced name, even though, is because the reality, as I said, we wanted it to be inclusive of all different kinds of models, because there's a bunch of different kinds of models that are emerging in response to various kinds of cultural and legal contexts. And they all share common underlying principles, which is the jurisprudence, ecological jurisprudence. Some of them are rights of nature, and some of them don't really talk about rights so much, but they talk about other frameworks for sort of enforcing this paradigm shift to a more systems approach and prioritizing functioning of ecosystems and things like that.
And keep in mind that the work that is emerging here is really deep cultural work, in which law becomes a manifestation of that. Because you start to unpack it, this is 180 degrees away from what the existing system subscribes to. So as you can imagine, those who profit from it don't want to see something like this emerge, because it actually either devolves or eliminates their control. So, but any good movement that's what good movements do, right? They instill justice, they transform the system, but in doing so, it's not going to be an easy road. So I only bring that up because there's no straight line path here. It's going to be a lot of meandering like water does. It's going to be a lot of being dammed up. You can use all kinds of water metaphors for what the rights of nature work is really about, at least in this country. Other places have had, let's say, a more successful means of getting there, but it's still largely about people power. So it's the people power that can animate the legal element. We're not at a point where legal practitioners can take rights of nature in this country and actually advocate in the way that we can with existing law. So we're at a very emerging stage of what rights of nature could look like on this continent, whether it's non-Indigenous communities or even Indigenous communities, because there's going to be difficulty there with the federal government and how that interfaces. So it's going to be a battle. So we have to have good energy, but we also have to understand that it's going to be a long road before this would ideally be the reality.
No, it's an amazing thing. This definitely spans the ideological continuum. I mean, because where I live, out in the sticks, rednecks everywhere, and they love this. They love the notion of, hey, corporations. Why should corporations have more power and privilege to do harm in our communities than we have to protect ourselves from that harm?
Well, there's a whole lot more of these guys than there are of us. And
yeah, I
so
know, but there's a way that we come together around this overlord of corporations who don't live in our communities telling us what's up. You know, we like to say democracy is a good idea and we ought to try it. Because we don't have one. We don't live in a democracy, we live in a corporatocracy. That's clear. You know, and this is civil disobedience through lawmaking. We acknowledge that this law is unjust, that protects helicopters spraying us. That's not fair. And so we, the people, these folks feel the same way. I mean, there's cancer clusters everywhere, and they don't just hit the hippies, they go to everybody, you know? So, I mean, really, this is an opportunity for us to find common ground.
What types of initiatives are more likely to get enacted and then also survive at any level in the court system, particularly in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the answer depends entirely on the legal and political system of what country you want to talk about. So the reality is that because we are in a federal system, we both have a legal structure that's federal and a political system that is basically dysfunctional due to hyperpartisanship. The reality is it's, you know, you got to do a bottom-up sort of approach, and that is sort of the story of sort of American, that's, you know, how lawmaking, creative lawmaking happens in the United States. So you start with local experiments, and then as they get a certain amount of, you know, maybe then some states adopt it, and then it spreads or whatever. And so it's time-consuming. It's sort of like long-term, and so there are. That's a long way of saying if you want examples of how this has been implemented in practice and how that has affected watershed protection in a different way, I would have to mainly give you other country examples. However, because in the United States there isn't yet an example where, there are lots of examples where these ordinances are passed. They get on the ballot, they're adopted, and then sometimes corporations choose to challenge them and sometimes they don't, right? And so depending on how important they think it is for them to spend the time, effort, and money. There is yet an example in the United States where it's been challenged in court and courts have upheld rights of nature because of preemption laws, essentially. However, there are quite a few examples of jurisdictions, and Pittsburgh is a really good example. I think Pittsburgh is one of the larger jurisdictions that has adopted rights of nature ordinances, and they did it specifically to try to ban natural gas, like injection of wastewater from natural gas fracking. Now, they, essentially, long story short, what happened was, instead of challenging it in court, the gas company said, screw this, we're just gonna go elsewhere. So now on one hand, you could say, did that fail or succeed? I mean, ultimately they got what they wanted, which is they preempted the natural gas fracking within the bounds limits of Pittsburgh, essentially by saying it's too making it more costly than the company wanted to deal with it. Now they could have chosen to fight it in court, and they probably would have won eventually. So that's essentially the best case scenario right now. But I mean, you got to see this as one step in a longer term goal of trying to change paradigms in people, so that then ultimately, though, to be effectively implemented, you're going to have to see this stuff being adopted at state law, so that you can get past the preemption problem.
Yeah, it's sort of what I was getting at is, I guess, chinks in the armor.
Yeah, and so that's what you're starting, the strategy. I mean, Michelle can talk to you better than I can about the strategy, but you try to build these grassroots movements. When you get enough momentum to have a statewide movement, then you go for the statewide thing, and then eventually the idea would be as more states adopt it, then there becomes a national.
I mean, from a historical reference point, you could look at the suffragists and the passing of local and state laws in defiance to the federal law. Marriage equality, another good example of people taking action here in Oregon specifically. So this is where that legal cultural convergence comes into play. We're not at a point where the existing system wants to uphold it or take it seriously. They want to actually get rid of it, and they can very easily because of the way that the legal apparatus is constructed. But it's about doing it anyway, to Michelle's point, because that is ultimately what could break through to create the possibility of a rights of nature construct. And of course, that's not easy, it's scary, but it's the very things that have shifted other realms of injustice that were legalized. And I don't think the rights of nature work is any different than those past movements, or
We
current
actually-
movements in a lot of ways.
We actually, in our vision that catapults us into this kind of action, is that it'll be like a patchwork quilt. So Lane County passes the watershed protection, and then Lincoln County, and then Benton County, and then pretty soon you have a blanket. We are coming for state preemption. That has always been one of our guiding principles, because state preemption, it's another unifying principle that brings disparate groups together, because it's what keeps us from being able to do what we know we need to do. So we're coming for state preemption, we're building capacity. And actually, a few years ago, a bunch of us community rights folks were in the Rocky Mountains, and we wrote, I think it's how many amendments are there? It's the 28th Amendment to the Federal Constitution that gives people the right to self-government. And it says that people have the right to write and pass laws that protect our health, safety, and welfare. So we're scaffolding this thing. We're starting here in Lane County. Likely I'll be passing the baton on to my kids and their kids. This work is long, and it's not for the faint of heart. It's very purposeful and very delicious to be doing this. And there is this rub between the planet begging us to get off our butts and help her now, and the reality that nothing happens overnight. So we just dig in until we get what we know we deserve and what our kids deserve and their kids deserve. We ain't going nowhere.
And people who are studying law or are lawyers, I think Ecuador has a lot of good cases to sort of look at how does the legal system adjudicate these things. So it's important, because the way the law gets formulated then is going to determine how these things get interpreted. And so those are things to dive into and understand, even if they're not going to be implemented and accessible and operational yet here. We've got some decent models that are emerging.
Interestingly, when we wrote our spray ban, we made it a charter amendment, because that can't happen. They cannot repeal it. It has to go back to the people. But that got us into some other kind of crazy shenanigans that I won't bore you with. And so this one that we're doing is a straight protect. It's an ordinance. It's just an initiative. And yes, they can come for us. We know that. But this work is really bigger than just one ordinance. It's about exposing the insane system for what it really is, that it doesn't protect us. And the idea is that when the county commissioners come to repeal your measure passed by a majority of the voters in your community, the community gets mad. And so this is building this awareness that's going to shift our minds, because it's really, the biggest problem is like right here. We don't believe we have a role to play. We don't believe we have enough power. I mean, it's us, and we have to instill that in ourselves. And so when a county commission comes for us like that, that's fuel for our fire. We're going to use it.
I mean, the basic notion of rights of nature is, I would say, close to that. But there's serious issues when you start to recognize a natural entity as a legal person, which has happened in places. The problem with legal person, in most cases, it then assumes you have liability potential. So that means the river could then be liable just like a legal person could. And that's not what rights of nature is moving towards. So there's a need to reimagine sort of the naturehood reality versus just trying to overlay a legal personhood construct to ecosystems.
Can I say a little bit? Yeah. So exactly. So as we've been talking, part of the purpose of these endeavors is to try to change like people's paradigm about how they conceptualize nature and humans' relationship with it. And there's a lot of research now, both in the United States as well as in other countries, that show when you structure rights of nature as legal personhood, meaning you give it the same, like as a juridical person equal to a corporation or trust or anything else, that tends to undermine that that entity, because you're essentially, rather than trying to recognize nature as different from sort of a person and people as part of nature, you're sort of anthropomorphizing nature and inserting it into an anthropocentric legal system. And it actually has perverse negative consequences when you do that. There's some research that's been done by Aaron O'Neill, who shows that legally it's not that different from saying just water trust boards, where you have, like you say, some guardianship mechanism that recognize like a watershed. They're structured as a trust, and the trust is a legal person, and they speak on behalf of the watershed and so forth and so on. And there's a lot of research that shows that when you structure it like that, far from people starting to value the watershed for its intrinsic worth and value, people start to see it as yet another water user that they're competing with, and they try to start discounting, they start to sort of mentally discount the interests of the watershed. And so, anyway, so it is complicated, but what research has been done has shown that it tends to actually have these negative perverse incentives.
I would say we have some allies. I don't think we have a lot of spine in our allies. I mean, they talk a good line and they'll tell you you're doing great work, but basically I don't spend much time there. I talk to people because this is a people's movement. And yes, they're people, but I think they forgot it because they have to get elected, they have to do the bidding of the campaign financiers. So, there are a couple good ones, but this is where the good ones are. It's the people who understand that it's up to us. We just cannot look for help elsewhere. It's just us. And the people that get attracted to this kind of work are some stellar humans, just intrepid warriors. And so, I invite people all the time to check out your inner and outer intrepid warrior and join us.
Can I say like a quick word about? So I've talked with some state legislators, and I won't name names because I don't want to get them in trouble. But on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, and my impression is that they're not actually opposed to like the environmental protection portion of so there are some that would favor, in theory, this kind of an ordinance that protects, watersheds. What concerns them is the challenge to preempt state preemption. Because, I think that there are some that said, if I was confident we could limit the state preemption to only environmental protection, then I would be in favor of that. What I'm afraid is that if we wipe out state preemption across the board, then the people I don't like are going to use it to pass local laws on other issues not related to environmental protection that I'm afraid will violate the rights of some community I care about or do this, that, or the other. Whether it's like gun rights or bathroom laws or like whatever it is.
I welcome my neighbors, whatever they're thinking, to do this kind of, write a law. It's hard work. I would rather take on those folks than have a corporation that doesn't live in my community that doesn't have to pay the price of whatever corporate activity that is harming us. That's why quote unquote capital D democracy is messy. Because you'll have people that want to put out an initiative that says everyone should be able to have an assault rifle, and okay, get that on the ballot. At least I can vote against it. But when a corporation just waltzes in and starts doing their thing, I don't stand a fighting chance. So I want to reel those people in. I think corporate privilege is criminal.
And another way, legally speaking, to think about it is you can have floors and you can have ceilings. Mm-hmm. And the issue right now is there's a very sharp trajectory of the use of state ceiling preemption to undermine local decision-making. Whether it's been around food issues or rent control or wages or environmental issues, corporate interests are obviously controlling state legislators and using that particular legal doctrine to dictate downwards. Because the basic structure of the U.S. system of government is top-down. It's very centralized, it's very preemptive, and ultimately it's very privatizing. So the economic interests basically work hand in hand with the governmental entities to basically privatize their ventures. And then we live the consequences of it all. As an example of why, in some cases, there aren't really accidents, the recent train derailment in Ohio is often called an accident. That's not an accident, that's an outcome of a consumeristic, capitalistic, top-down system. So we also have to reframe how we actually respond to these things, and language matters. And so using the right kind of language is important. Also, that it is this convergence of all kinds of things. It's not just going to be the lawmaking, it is going to be the personal transformation, the community coming together, and really harder resistance, in my opinion. There's got to be a lot harder resistance to actually stop the destruction, because the legal system itself hasn't caught up yet. And so it's a multitude of things. We didn't invent it, we didn't want it, but here we are. So the question is, what's our response? So kind of to Michelle's point, what are we going to do about it, I think is still the principal question. And how we go about doing it does matter. The question is, do we keep doing it the same ways, or can we imagine doing it differently? Because largely, if we're going to crawl into the existing rules and regulations, it's largely the other guys' script, and it makes us predictable, and the outcomes really are not very pretty, and they're accumulating in a way that's really undermining life itself, not just for humans, but other species. I want to give you guys sort of a couple minutes for last closing, and then I'm sure people want to talk amongst each other.
So I'm sure most of you know, Ecuador, in terms of actual implementation of rights of nature law and how it's actually changing watershed protection, it's happening furthest in Ecuador, mainly because Ecuador was one of the first countries to adopt one of the recognized, a law recognizing rights of nature, and they didn't just pass any law, they actually put it in their constitution, which obviously gives it way more enforceability. And it took about a decade for judges in the country to figure out how to interpret that and what it meant, so it was a little bit slow, but in recent years there's been a huge number of cases being selected by the Constitutional Court to establish binding jurisprudence regarding how rights of nature fits with other kinds of constitutional rights. And one of the things that's resulted from that in the last couple of years, particularly as it's been applied to watershed protection, there is, in addition to sort of establishing the precautionary principle, that is switching the burden of proof from a community to show that there's going to be harm. You're shifting it to, say, the mining company or whatever company to show that they won't inflict such a harm that it will threaten the ability of the ecosystem to regenerate and so forth. But the other thing it's done, which I think is really interesting and important for people who study environmental law, is that it's changed the criteria for measuring outcomes from procedural requirements. That is to say, for example, just getting an environmental impact assessment, or did you get the right license or the right permit, right? The standard practice for measuring whether a project is sustainable or is environmentally friendly or what have you is typically, did you just pass all the procedural hoops? Did you do your environmental impact assessment? Did you get the right license or permit from the appropriate agency? And if you can check out those boxes, in the past, courts would just say, okay, you're good to go, it's legal, there's nothing we can do, so forth and so on. What Rights of Nature did in Ecuador is to say that is no longer sufficient, because what Rights of Nature says is, I don't care, regardless of whatever procedural requirements the government created and therefore you jump through, that has no bearing on the real question about rights of nature, which is the health of the ecosystem. And so it's fundamentally changed the way sustainable development projects are measured and whether or not they can go forward. Courts, the Constitutional Court is finding that that mining companies and other kinds of companies, like hydroelectric companies and so forth, even though they did all the things the government said they needed to do procedurally, they were still found, in some cases, criminally liable for violating the rights of a watershed because the impact was so large. And that's a fundamental difference. Basically, one of the impacts of going from traditional environmental law to a rights of nature framework is that you're shifting the focus from sort of did you comply with certain procedural process, certain procedural requirements, to is the health of the ecosystem still okay, or is you're looking at environmental outcomes as opposed to compliance with procedures.
So, current law does not protect the planet and her creatures. And once you make that determination that the EPA is not going to give you comfort, it passed those protections. Once you realize that you are not going to be protected by your government in this time, you take it on your own shoulders. Community rights it's a empowering people movement, and so it really is up to us. We've got an idea here that we think is worth pursuing, protecting the watershed. And so we invite people, we invite you to join us. I think most people in this room can think well and hard enough to know that what's going on right now is not working. So why wouldn't we do something different? And that's what this proposal is. It is a different way. It's essentially realizing a different relationship with the natural world. And we can do that, no doubt.
I have one thing to share, my little closing gift. So I feel like what I can bring here is that idea of culture and shifting culture and first of all, big ups to all the lawyer warriors out here that are doing this awesome work, and I love that. I'm out of my element. I'm a raptivist, an artivist, and I feel like my addition to this is to be a culture shifter, change maker, and I want to. I feel the way I can help is extend this work to the youth, right? To the high schoolers, to the middle schoolers, to all the kids out there that they want to see this change just as much as we do, and it's more important to them than it is to us. We've got more time on this planet, and we're going to be gone before they get to live their lives. So I see that what I can do is try to bring on the youth and support the youth movement through arts and culture. And I'm going to share a little bit of a song and a rap for you all. This is my way of giving back. And then also, like in Indigenous communities, we like to open and close with these types of things, these songs, and they're gifts, and they are ways of saying thank you. In the spirit of crazy horse, a supernatural force, I bring the sounds of the burial ground all across the nations to all the different races. And one thing's the same, oppression it remains for the almighty dollar. Fathers will sell daughters and brothers will kill brothers. So it seems cash is king. Cha-ching, I guess I'm hunting royalty. Watch me catch my royalties, the spoils of these wars and these tours across the land. I do it for my fam, and I do it for my clan. I do it for creation, all my relations. Said I do it for my fam, and I do it for my clan. I do it for creation, all my relations. Said, way